Obviously, I'd like to thank Bob on guitar and Dave on accordion. Accordion, yep. They are from Snippets, so they'll play a little bit later as well too. So welcome, brothers, sisters, friends, and comrades. My name is Ceremonies. For those of you who don't know me, I am a workers' compensation representative for UFCW Locals 175 and 633. We proudly represent approximately 8,000 members here in Guelph. I'm extremely passionate about helping injured workers. If my daughter was here, you'll know because she says I work too much. But the province of Ontario, especially under the Ford government, continues to ignore and fail injured workers. I'm also here as a delegate of the Guelph District Labour Council and a volunteer co-chair of today's event. So workers deserve to arrive home safely at the end of the workday and to live a life that's not cut short because of fatalities, occupational illness, or because of injury sustained at work. For those we mourn who have lost their lives or grieve for those fighting to stay safe at work, we have April 28th, which is the day we remember those whose lives were lost and those whose lives were forever changed due to unsafe conditions in the workplace. We have a responsibility to do better for today's workers, and we owe it to the families who have lost their loved ones to preventable workplace accidents and illnesses, and to the workers whose lives have been forever altered because of something that happened at work. As I'm sure everyone loves statistics, I'm just going to be brief. I tried to do a little bit of research, but it was kind of hard to find. The website for WSIB is pretty limited. But we do know that over 300,000 workers were injured or made sick at work. And to be clear, these are only ones based on reported injuries. Thousands and thousands go unreported. But I did find from 2020 to 2024, there was 345 traumatic fatalities, 735 occupational disease deaths, 133 workplace COVID deaths, and that totals 1,213. And again, these are only the allowed claims at WSIB. These numbers are just the tip of the iceberg because they include only those fatalities and injuries that are reported and accepted. Thousands are denied, and workers have to fight tooth and nail to get the compensation they deserve. So I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Willie Knowles. Willie is an injured worker and has been the acting president and executive vice president of ONIWAG, the Ontario Network of Injured Workers Group. It's a democratically governed organization which has been representing injured workers since 1991, and they have firsthand experience of the WSIB system to assist workers. But more importantly, they are at the forefront of the injured workers community and continue to lobby and raise public awareness about what needs to be fixed in Ontario's broken workers' compensation system. I was at the launch of the Workers' Comp is a Right campaign in 2017 and have worked with Willie since in public awareness, June 1st Injured Workers Day, our Christmas Debo, and many more compensation workshops and events. So welcome, Willie.
Woo. Thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you all for coming. And I noticed that just as we were getting started, the sun actually started to come out.
Yes.
So I think the heavens are looking down upon us today and saying, now you have a chance to recognize those injured workers who have either lost their lives or have lost a limb or have suffered traumatic mental injuries. And unfortunately, that's what's happening across the world. And on top of that, we have occupational disease now. Occupational diseases actually accounted for 63% of the deaths that we reported across Canada in 2022, which is the last year for which stats are available. That's scary. And we also know that one of the other rising forms of injuries now are people who are facing violent assaults at work. You have nurses that are facing patients who are not fully regulated, as a tactful way of putting it. You also have teachers now that are facing students that are not well behaved, to put it tactfully. And no worker should go to work fearing that they could get hurt that day. That shouldn't be the case. When you leave your home in the morning, you should have a guarantee that at 5 o'clock or whenever your shift is done, that you're going home, that you're not going to a hospital or to a morgue. That can't be allowed. One death is one death too many. And the other thing that really gets into my craw is the fact that when a worker is injured, 9 times out of 10, the regulators go soft on employers. I was just reading a case today of a co-op grocery store in Saskatchewan, a 14-year-old worker. The manager told him to use a pressure washer in an enclosed area. 14 years old, he was poisoned by carbon monoxide and died. And what was the repercussions? They were told to fix the problem. That's nice. You're gonna fix the problem, but meanwhile, you've got a kid who's just starting his life and he's been killed, and that's the only repercussion is that you get a slap on the wrist and told, do better. What does that say to employers? It's basically saying, well, if you kill a worker, so what? It's just the cost of doing business. That is reprehensible. As I say again, one death is one far too many deaths. I don't want to hear that, oh, well, it was an accident or it was their fault, because that's the other thing. WSIB is really good at playing the blame game, that it was the injured workers' fault that they got injured. Because you know that there's a lot of people that go to work and they're just thinking of a way to get injured because they really want to spend their days in agony and pain with their legs up in the air because it's a good way to make some money. Really, come on. Does anybody really believe that bullshit? Because I can't think of anybody. That's certainly not my idea of how to get some free money. And the idea of free money, after all, is only 85% of your net earnings. And of course, Ford promised in the last election that he was going to raise that to 90%. We're halfway through the term. We're on to our second labor minister. And has anybody heard even a whisper of the government planning to implement that promise? Has anybody? I know I haven't heard anything. We've been asking now since Monty McNaughton was appointed minister back in 2019 to meet with them. And it's silence, it's radio silence. When Lori Scott was there for her brief tenure, she met with us 3 times. Obviously, the message came down, no, you do not want to be talking to those injured workers because they're a bunch of rabble-rousers. Because we want to do things like fix the system. But anyway, this is definitely the day that we mourn for the dead, but we fight like hell for the living. And I want to thank you all for coming out today, because that really does show that there are people in the community who care for injured workers and who care for all workers. So thank you very much.
Good job. Thank you, ladies. Thanks so much, Willie. I know your passion to speak is always there. I love it. So workplace accidents and illnesses are preventable and should never be seen as just part of the job or a cost of doing living, like Willie said. We also know that the number of workplace deaths, accidents, and illness are on the rise. This is unacceptable for so many obvious reasons. And this year also marks the 20th anniversary of the West Ray Law, and it was named for the workers' lives that were lost in Nova Scotia. It allowed for employers to be charged criminally, but is rarely utilized legal argument. We've come a long way in improving occupational health and safety laws, but more needs to be done. such as a stronger enforcement to make a real difference in reducing the numbers of workers killed and injured on the job. And while some employers invest in prevention and workers' safety, too many employers continue to cut corners and costs at the expense of the workers' safety. This outrageous behavior costs livelihoods and lives. Our next speaker is Tina McPherson from the Workers' Health and Safety Center. Tina is the Director of Program Development, and she leads a talented group of adult education and program development specialists at the Workplace Safety Insurance. That's a mouthful, isn't it? Workplace Health and Safety Center, Ontario's only government-designated labor-endorsed health and safety training program. Tina has worked at the Workers' Health and Safety Center for 28 years, most recently as a program developer and managing this critical work group. And for 23 of those years, Tina was a member of COPE Local 343, and for 13 years served on the executive board in various roles. But for her, her most important job is mother to two children, Jada and Michaela. Welcome, Tina. Woo.
Hello. I'm so very pleased to be here representing the Workers' Health and Safety Center, Ontario's only government-designated, labor-endorsed health and safety training provider. In our worker community, hard-won health and safety rights are always top of mind day of mourning. So this year at the Workers' Health and Safety Center, we have focused our messaging on the worker right to participate in the fight for much-needed transition to a greener, cleaner economy, one that, if designed properly, will safeguard worker health and safety and the health of us all. What does this fight look like? In the short term, among other things, workers and their representatives are pushing for workplace and legislative action to protect against the growing peril of heat waves and other extreme weather events. But as all occupational health and safety activists know, we also need to move action upstream to the source of the hazard. To date, most action in this vein has been about green energy solutions and electric vehicles. Perhaps more important, though, is the need for greater action on what we make and how we make it. More important, because fewer are working in this absolutely necessary avenue for change. Now is no time for half measures. As profits shrink in the pursuit of zero-emission energy, big oil is using toxic chemicals as a lifeline. They are initiating a massive build-out of petrochemical plants to supply producers of industrial chemicals, plastics, and pesticides, rapidly becoming the world's largest driver of global oil consumption. The human cost associated with this industry extends beyond the climate crisis they have created, though. Research points to the mounting evidence linking petrochemicals to chronic and deadly conditions killing millions around the planet each year. In our workplaces, worker health and safety reps can expand their efforts by creating toxics inventories and undertaking the painstaking process of working to substitute petroleum-based materials with those developed from greener sources. In Ontario, this work would move faster with the reinstatement of mandatory toxic use reduction laws and the dedicated research and development programs other jurisdictions enjoy. Workers also need a seat at the table to ensure the green transition is a just one. No worker should lose their livelihood in the shift to an economy that will benefit us all. To this end, our federal parliament has recently responded to worker demands with the Sustainable Jobs Act. Finally, in the fight for change, I wouldn't be much of an emissary for the Workers' Health and Safety Center if I didn't invoke the need for quality training. For instance, as a movement, we have been advancing a mandatory WHMIS training standard because occupational disease is the single biggest killer of workers in this province, and because videos, PowerPoint slide decks, and so-called e-learning aren't cutting it when it comes to safeguarding workers' health and safety and their right to know. In closing, it's clear the fight to reshape our economy won't be an easy one. If you haven't yet, please join our movement for greener, cleaner work. Our lives and our planet depend upon it. Thank you.
Woo. Thanks so much, Tina. So, government and decision makers must do more to make work safe now. They can start by ensuring police and lawyers receive appropriate training and by increasing unannounced inspection blitzes to uncover safety violations and hold neglectful employers accountable. It also means ensuring workers are aware of potential hazards by properly labeling products in the workplace, providing adequate PPE that fits all body types and users, creating a national plan to remove toxic substances from the workplace, strengthening laws that protect workers against violence and harassment, and ensuring workers know their rights and have the tools to be safe on the job. The next speaker does not need much of an introduction. I'm sure you all know, met or worked with Janice Folk-Dawson. Janice is a staunch advocate for injured workers, being an injured worker herself. But she takes her passion to help others to her union CUPE, her time as vice president of the OFL, and her next adventure is our latest NDP candidate for the upcoming federal election. Welcome, Janice.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is a really different perspective. Normally we are standing over there and facing this way, and this is the first year that we are standing, like it's a whole different perspective that I'm seeing, and I'm really glad to be having this perspective. So I wanted to say that Mike Schreiner, our MPP, and I were supposed to be doing this part because we wanted to talk about the fact that it doesn't matter what political party you come from. The fact that Day of Mourning needs to be a time when we come together, no matter what our party is, to make sure that workers are not injured and workers are not killed in the workplace. And it's only when we all come together that that's actually going to happen. So Mike was trying really hard. He's been up north doing a lot of, and he contacted me this morning, said he wasn't able to make it, but he sent a statement and he's asked me if I would read that statement. So before I make my comments, I'd like to read a statement that Mike sent this morning. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to share my thoughts with you on this National Day of Mourning. I'm so sorry I could not be with you in person to recognize and remember those who have lost their lives or who have been injured at work. I am grateful to the thousands of workers in Guelph who keep our city and businesses running each and every day. The National Day of Mourning is an opportunity to recommit to doing everything we can to keep them safe at work. Every single worker, no matter their occupation, deserves to return home safe and healthy at the end of the day. That is why I will continue to push for stronger workplace safety laws, inspections, and enforcement. I will also continue to call for reforms to WSIB, including an end to the practice of deeming, so that injured workers and their families receive the financial support they deserve. I believe we all owe a debt of gratitude to frontline and essential workers, including workers in education, healthcare, developmental services, and other public services, as well as grocery workers, delivery drivers, and so many others who went into work during the pandemic emergency. Improving workplace safety is a way to recognize the inequities that the pandemic emergency highlighted. I will continue to push for adequate funding and staffing levels to address workplace conditions for educators, healthcare workers, and care providers. And I will continue to push for a minimum of 10 paid sick days and an end to routine sick notes. No worker should have to put themselves and their co-workers at risk, being forced to choose between going to work sick or being able to pay the bills. Thank you to the Guelph and District Labor Council for organizing today's event and for all you do to support workers in our community. To the families and friends of workers who have lost their lives on the job, my heart is with you and my office is open to serve you. Mike Schreiner, MPP, Guelph. And one of the things I wanted to say too is in my 4 years at the OFL, Mike and I worked very hard at Queen's Park, and he worked to make sure that workers' rights, and especially around health and safety, were there. And so it certainly, we hope to continue that work over the next little while. So as was mentioned, my name is Janice Folk-Dawson. My pronouns are she and her. I am a settler, and I've resided and worked here on Upper Canada Treaty Number 3 territory for the past 38 years. I'm an injured worker with a permanent disability, and I always take the opportunity on the Day of Mourning to remember and share that one person's actions can make a difference. Day of Mourning came into being because a CUPE member took a resolution to a CUPE convention in 1984 to create a day of remembrance for workers who were killed at work. The resolution passed. A year later, the Canadian Labour Congress declared April 28th a day of mourning in Canada. April 28th was chosen because on April 28th, 1914, the first Compensation Act was adopted into legislation. By 1996, the International Labor Organization, the ILO, declared April 28th as an International Day of Mourning. One person's action means that we take this day to reflect and strategize. Comrades, today Guelph gathers on this day of mourning in Goldie Mill Park to remember the lives lost in our workplaces. The Labour Council has been gathering in this park beside the ruins of one of the oldest remaining workplaces to mark the day of mourning since the 90s. We installed the bench in 2001, and then the 2 ginkgo trees, and most recently, the soapbox. It is a day to honor the fallen, the workers who paid the ultimate price while simply trying to make a living for themselves and their families. But comrades, it is also a day of anger and frustration, for we must acknowledge that the yearly toll of 1,000 reported workplace deaths in Canada is simply unacceptable. In Ontario in 2021, there were a total of 341 allowed workplace fatalities. Remember, that's the reported deaths. And what is allowed? Either you died or you didn't die. How is it allowed to be a workplace fatality? Quite clearly, Ontario is a very dangerous workplace. We must not remain silent while workers continue to lose their lives to negligence and indifference. We must demand action from all 3 layers of government. There can be no more compromise, no more delays. It is their duty to protect those who keep our society functioning, who build our cities, and who fuel our economy. We, the working class, must stand united and fight for justice. Employers must be held accountable for the lives lost on their watch. No longer can they escape the consequences of their action. We must demand strict regulations, numerous and unannounced inspections, and penalties that will deter them from sacrificing workers' lives for profit and greed. But comrades, understand that this battle is not confined to the walls of our workplaces. We now face an even greater threat, the climate crisis. As the global temperature rises, the hazards faced by workers multiply. Yet shockingly, there is nothing in the Occupational Health and Safety Act regarding heat stress. That is nothing short of an abomination. Nor is there any regulation or guidance in the Occupational Health and Safety Act for dealing with smoke from forest fires, flooding or drought conditions in our workplaces and communities. We cannot ignore the rising temperatures, the scorching heat waves that put workers' lives at risk. We need legislation now more than ever to protect workers from heat-related illnesses, exhaustion, and even death. The climate crisis is real and it is upon us. We cannot allow anyone to dismiss the urgency of this matter. We must use this day of mourning as a catalyst for change. We must work together, our voices echoing through the halls of power, demanding our governments take immediate and decisive action. We can no longer tolerate the needless loss of lives. We will no longer accept workplaces that sacrifice workers for profit. Today, we must pledge our unwavering commitment to the cause of workers' safety. We will not rest until our demands are met and legislation is in place. We must fight for justice, fight for those who can no longer fight for themselves. I say to Labour, union and Labour councils, we must implement a campaign so that every worker in this province learns their 3 rights as per the Occupational Health and Safety Act. The right to know, the right to participate, and the right to refuse unsafe work. All levels of government and all political parties must implement policies and legislation that ensures these rights and the safeties of workers, their families, and communities. Municipal government, and I see Phil here today, along with thinking about the safety of your employees, I ask you to think about 2 other groups. First, those workers, employed and unemployed, who are underhoused, and those whose homes is a tent or in a safe corner. And second, those workers who work in the encampments or provide maintenance for public streets and spaces, for their input. Ask them for their input for part of the solution while they're providing education about their rights. The provincial government, and I said this to Mike this morning, we need the provincial government to address the Occupational Health and Safety Act insufficiencies and create sector-specific regulations. There's no regulations for working in education. They've been trying for a long time to get them. The provincial government could make that happen tomorrow, and we would be able to address that situation much more effectively. We also need to implement protective measures for tenants, perhaps through the Landowner Tenant Act, but we must recognize the reality that for many, they enter someone's home to provide care and it becomes their workplace. For many others, since COVID, their home has become their workplace. So we can no longer separate home from workplaces. The federal government needs to ensure that the rights of federal regulated workplace workers are enhanced and enforced. And we must demand environmental regulations that address the climate crisis we are facing are implemented. I loop back to every person can make a difference point I began with. If you leave here today with the commitment to teach your children or family member their 3 rights under the Occupational Health and Safety Act, the right to know, the right to participate, and the right to refuse unsafe work, you will have made a difference, perhaps saving their lives or other lives and preventing injury. Today, we mourn for the dead and we fight like hell for the living. Together, we will prevail. Peace and solidarity.
I think I can unequivocally say that when Janice wins the election, a lot of those promises are going to come true. So lastly, I am happy to welcome our newest Guelph District Labour Council President. Nicole Clark is an early childhood educator and belongs to OSSTF, currently working in the Upper Grand District School Board. She is currently president of the Guelph and District Labour Council, as well as being the president for both the federal and provincial Wellington, Halton Hills, NDP riding associations.
I am gonna start off by saying following Janice is like a really hard, that was a hard walk coming up here to follow Janice. So good afternoon. I'd like to thank everyone who came despite the weather, because it's been a hit or miss kind of day, so thrilled to see everybody. And I wanted to thank you for coming to this event. It's an important event because it brings to light the dangers that still exist at our workplaces. It allows us a moment to remember those who had union protection behind them and health and safety advocates at their workplaces, but it wasn't enough for those brothers and sisters to get home to their families at night. It allows us to mourn for those without privileges who may have had only corporation checklists for health and safety, like the recent death of the 67-year-old Alora Rona worker who was killed by a customer while working. This moment also must be shared with those workers with hidden injuries, heart attack, stroke, mental health, who have died or have been out of work because of the environment that we are now forced to work in. We are here to mourn those we have lost and to light a fire in our bellies, to move forward and fight for those who are in workplaces now or those who will soon to come. I'd like to take this moment to invite anybody who would like to come and speak on others' behalf or their own.
Thanks, Jen. Thank you, Nicole, and thank you, Sarah, for everything that you've presented so far today. I'd also like to thank our troubadours, Bob and Dave, for bringing us the music they did. How about a hand for them? Musicians are workers, and they deserve fair pay. So buy them a beer at the Diana. I'm up here for one reason only. How many of you would say that you have an environmental conscience? Just put up your hand if you believe that we should protect the environment. Of course we do. Now, How many of you believe that your first experience with environmental activism was within the workplace? A long time ago, in a workplace far, far away, workers understood the relationship between pollutants and their own health quite well. They understood asbestos, creosote, coal dust. They understood the dangers posed by cotton mills. They understood them very, very well. And there was no environmental movement. I think it's time that we push the notion, as Jan did very, very well today, that the environment and the workplace go hand in hand, always without exception. It doesn't matter whether you're in the workplace, whether you're on a bus, whether you're working on the road, whether you're working in an office. You are being surrounded by toxins that are going to hurt you. They can stress you, they can cause you respiratory problems, they can cause you cardiac issues. It doesn't matter whether you're a public worker or a private worker, we are all susceptible to the same things. And I have a challenge for everyone here today. And that is very simply, for next year, bring one person out here who believes that they are an environmentalist and say, let's make the environment front and center in the workplace as well as on the outside. Yesterday, I planted trees for Guelph because we need those carbon sinks in order to ensure that our air gets better. We need it for the generations that are to come. There's no difference between being a volunteer, planting a tree, and helping to improve the environment, and somebody refusing unsafe work. You're improving everything for everyone always. I want to thank the Guelph Labour Council for this annual event. I want to thank us all, and I want to remember a few people. I want to remember Barry Fowley and Alan Pickersgill and others who for eons stood up for workers inside and outside the workplace and said, you have a right to safe work. It's not about PPEs. It's not about workers' compensation. It's about knowing that when you go into work, you're going to come home safe and sound. Thank you very much.
Hello, my name's Lisa McWinning. I want to thank the organizers to this. So my adoptive father worked at W.C. Woods for 30 odd years. That's where he spent his career dealing with Freon. And later in life, he developed 4 different types of cancer. And at one point, the doctor said to him, he said, what did you do for a living? And my dad said, I worked in refrigeration. So my dad died directly and suffered, he had to have a kidney removed and chemo and yada, yada, yada to deal with cancers that were a direct result of his workplace that were unrecognized. I think too, unfortunately, we've gotten to a point where everything needs to be done faster. So I worked at the Homewood Health Center in the dining room for a short period of time, and one of my coworkers was told she wasn't going fast enough. The whole point was to get out there half an hour early. Well, the supervisors stood and watched while all of us worked harder and faster. So I think automation has led to a point where we are expected to be machines. We are expected to move faster. We're expected to do repetitive work that machines often break down doing. If I'm in a restaurant, I don't necessarily need the wait staff or the chefs to work faster. What I do need is for them to say, I'll be right with you. Have you ever been in a lineup of a coffee shop and I'm getting infuriated because they're not moving fast enough and not taking my order, but the bigger problem is they're not recognizing that I'm standing there. And so if there was a simple, I'll be right with you, that would make a big difference, some human interaction. I think at one point I worked in mental health, but I was also a recipient of mental health, and they had a session where they asked us where the gaps were in the services. And one thing I pointed out was that the politicians and heads of companies and things don't recognize when people are in their own families are suffering from mental health. And I think the same thing happens when these laws are made. I think addiction to money is rampant and power. So, if we recognize that our children are now suffering because pursuit of money was the number one thing, and so now they're made to do unethical things or unsafe things in order to keep that money flow going. Like that gentleman was saying about the environment, I mean, it's pretty much done, and I feel like in the last stretch of the race, it's the survival of the fittest. The animals and people and environment that are still left are either going to carry us forward or they're going to take us out one way or another. And part of that is learning to do work that is meaningful to us. I mean, I read that work is work. Work is hard at times. But it can also be very meaningful. It can be productive. It can be sad. It can be hard, but it can also be very worthwhile, and it gives my life meaning. I don't want to sit around and do nothing. I like to create, but we often fit into careers where the money is good, where our families lead us. A doctor, for example, becomes a doctor because their father was a doctor and they forced them into it. What kind of doctor are you going to be if the only reason you're there is because your daddy told you to, and they would have been shunned if they didn't. What kind of doctor are you going to be, right? If we don't do what's important to us, what we value, then chances are we are going to get hurt because our bodies are going to rebel. You say, I don't want to do this work anymore, and our wrist is going to go to force us to make a decision that our friends and relatives may not understand on an emotional level, so our bodies take over and we get sick and then take ourselves out of the game. So, like I said, I appreciate you all being here. And like I said, if I was to make one suggestion for the frontline staff, some self-defense courses would probably, no, I'm serious. A lot of them are women, and we're taught to be, submissive and try to comfort by there, but that's not always going to work. So being able to physically defend myself has made a big difference in how I handle myself in lots of different environments. I grew up in a violent home, so learning to defend myself has been one of the biggest, for me, being treated equally. So thank you again.
Well, thank you for that. We are now going to lay our flowers and wreaths. So if you have a wreath to bring, or if you would like to take a flower, you can come and take a flower and lay it
around the two ginkgo trees.
Around the two ginkgo trees. Janice, can you point out the ginkgo tree? Because if you're like me, I don't know what a
Adam
ginkgo
is
tree
right at
looks
one
like.
ginkgo tree, and here is the second ginkgo
Great.
tree. And so there's spokes are on the end of them, and you can stick them in the ground.
What Janice said.
Yeah, will you start? You take the rose.